India, a land of vibrant colors, ancient traditions, and a billion dreams. It stands as a beacon of democracy, holding the title of the world's largest. A nation that, against all odds, managed to weave a tapestry of unity from a diverse array of languages, religions, and cultures. The world has watched in awe as India, year after year, carried out the massive exercise of democratic elections. Millions casting their votes, a testament to the power of the people's voice. India's journey has been one of resilience, a symbol of hope for emerging democracies. It has shown the world that even in the face of immense challenges, democracy can thrive. The echoes of its struggle for independence, a fight for freedom and self-determination resonated far beyond its borders, inspiring countless others to rise against oppression. Yet beneath the surface of this vibrant democracy, a disquieting narrative is unfolding. Whispers of discontent are growing louder, questioning the very soul of India's democratic spirit. The world looks on now with a sense of unease as shadows of doubt are cast on India's democratic future. The promise of equality and justice, once a beacon of hope, appears to be fading for many. The institutions designed to safeguard democracy seem to be faltering, their foundations cracking under the weight of unfulfilled promises. The voices of dissent, once celebrated as a sign of a healthy democracy, are slowly being silenced, replaced by a climate of fear and intimidation. The media, often hailed as the fourth pillar of democracy, seems to be losing its independent voice, succumbing to pressures that threaten to erode its credibility. The very fabric of Indian society, woven with threads of tolerance and mutual respect, appears to be fraying. Incidents of communal violence and social unrest raise urgent questions about the health of India's democracy. India stands at a crossroads, facing a critical juncture in its journey as a nation. The path ahead is fraught with uncertainty, a stark contrast to the optimism that once defined its future. The world holds its breath, watching as the fate of democracy hangs in the balance. The question is no longer whether India can sustain its democracy, but whether it can reclaim the soul of its democratic ideals. Can India, once a symbol of hope, confront its present challenges and chart a course towards a truly just and equitable society? India's tryst with democracy didn't begin in a vacuum. It emerged from the ashes of a brutal colonial past, scarred by centuries of British rule. The British Raj, while bringing with it infrastructure development and a unified administrative system, also left behind a legacy of economic exploitation and social division. India's resources were plundered, its industries crippled, and its people subjected to a system designed to keep them subservient. This period sowed the seeds of many challenges India faces today. The British employed a divide-and-rule policy, exploiting religious and caste differences to maintain control. This strategy exacerbated existing social fault lines, creating lasting tensions that continue to haunt India's social fabric. The scars of colonialism run deep, impacting not just India's economic trajectory, but also its political psyche. The struggle for independence, while uniting Indians across diverse backgrounds, also exposed the fragility of this unity. The partition of India and Pakistan, a bloody and traumatic event, further deepened these divisions, leaving behind a legacy of mistrust and animosity. Section 2. A Constitution of Hope. From the ashes of colonialism, India rose with a document that was both ambitious and aspirational, its Constitution. Enacted in 1950, it laid the foundation for a democratic republic, guaranteeing fundamental rights to all its citizens, regardless of religion, caste, creed, or gender. This was a radical experiment, a bold attempt to forge a modern nation from a society steeped in hierarchy and tradition. The architects of the Constitution, led by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, envisioned a society built on the principles of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. They understood that true democracy required more than just elections. It demanded social and economic justice. The Constitution became a beacon of hope, not just for India but for democracies around the world. The early decades after independence saw India grapple with the challenges of nation-building, poverty, and illiteracy. Yet, through it all, the democratic spirit endured. Elections were held regularly, governments changed peacefully, and the press, though at times facing pressure, remained relatively free. India, against all odds, seemed to be proving that democracy could indeed flourish in the developing world. Section 3. Fault lines of freedom. However, beneath the surface of this successful democracy, deep-rooted problems simmered. The promise of equality enshrined in the Constitution remained elusive for many. Caste-based discrimination continued to plague Indian society, relegating millions to the margins. The gap between the rich and the poor widened, and access to education, healthcare, and basic amenities remained a distant dream for a vast majority. The rise of identity politics, often fueled by opportunistic politicians, further aggravated social tensions. Regionalism, linguistic chauvinism, and religious fundamentalism began to chip away at the secular, pluralistic fabric of India. The promise of unity and diversity, a cornerstone of India's identity, faced increasing strain. As economic disparities grew, so did the frustration and anger of those who felt left behind. The institutions meant to safeguard democracy, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, often seemed slow and unresponsive to the needs of the common man. This growing disconnect between the rulers and the ruled created a fertile ground for discontent and unrest. Section 4. The Emergency, a democracy tested. India's democracy faced its most severe test in 1975, when then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, facing mounting political pressure and a court ruling against her, declared a state of emergency. Civil liberties were suspended, political opponents jailed, and the press censored. The emergency, as it came to be known, was a dark chapter in India's democratic history, a stark reminder of the fragility of democratic institutions. Though the emergency was lifted in 1977 and India returned to democratic rule, the experience left an indelible mark on the nation's psyche. It exposed the vulnerability of democratic institutions to authoritarian impulses and the constant vigilance required to safeguard them. The post-emergency years saw the rise of coalition politics, as regional parties gained prominence, challenging the dominance of the Congress Party, which had ruled India for most of its post-independence history. While this fragmentation of power offered new opportunities for representation, it also led to political instability and a weakening of the central government. The late 20th and early 21st centuries witnessed the rise of Hindu nationalism, embodied in the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP. The BJP, drawing upon a narrative of Hindu pride and a perceived sense of historical grievance, successfully tapped into the anxieties and aspirations of a large section of Indian society. The BJP's rise to power in 2014, with Narendra Modi at the helm, marked a significant shift in Indian politics. Modi, a charismatic and polarizing figure, promised economic development and a resurgent India, capturing the imagination of many, particularly among the youth. However, his tenure has also been marked by growing concerns about the erosion of democratic norms and values. Under the current regime, dissent, the lifeblood of a healthy democracy, is being systematically stifled. Critics of the government, be it activists, journalists, or even ordinary citizens, face increasing harassment, intimidation, and even violence. The space for free expression is shrinking, as the government utilizes its power to silence any voice that dares to question its policies or challenge its narrative. Peaceful protests, a cornerstone of democratic societies, are often met with brute force. The images of police brutality against students, farmers, and minority groups beamed across the world paint a chilling picture of a nation cracking down on its own people. Laws meant to protect citizens from discrimination are being twisted to target and silence those who dare to speak truth to power. The message is clear: toe the line or face the consequences. This climate of fear has a chilling effect on free speech, pushing dissent underground and creating an environment where self-censorship becomes the norm. The vibrancy of debate, the clash of ideas, so crucial for a functioning democracy, is being replaced by a deafening silence, a silence pregnant with unspoken fears and simmering discontent. India's democratic institutions, once considered a bulwark against authoritarianism, are facing an unprecedented crisis of credibility. The judiciary, often seen as the last resort for the common man, is increasingly perceived as being susceptible to political pressure. Key appointments are being made that raise concerns about the independence of the judiciary, and judgments often seem to favor the government's stance. The Election Commission, entrusted with the sacred duty of ensuring free and fair elections, has also faced criticism for its perceived bias. Allegations of electoral malpractices, voter suppression, and manipulation of electronic voting machines have cast a shadow on the integrity of the electoral process. The investigative agencies, once respected for their independence, are now seen as tools to target the government's opponents. Charges of corruption and sedition are being used indiscriminately to silence dissenting voices, while those in power seem to enjoy impunity. This erosion of institutional integrity strikes at the very heart of Indian democracy, undermining public trust and paving the way for an authoritarian future. Section 3. Silencing the Fourth Estate. The media, the fourth pillar of democracy, faces an existential crisis in India. Independent journalism is under threat, with journalists facing intimidation and violence. Media ownership is concentrated among business tycoons with ties to the ruling party. This suppresses critical reporting and amplifies a pro-government narrative. Social media spreads misinformation and propaganda, discrediting critics. This toxic mix is strangling the free press, leaving citizens vulnerable. Section 4. The rise of Hindu nationalism. The rise of Hindu nationalism, led by the BJP, threatens India's secular fabric and minority rights, especially Muslims. Policies like the Citizenship Amendment Act and the abrogation of Article 370 create fear among Muslims. This majoritarian agenda undermines India's democracy and principles of pluralism and tolerance. Section 5. The specter of a surveillance state. Adding to the growing list of concerns is the increasing use of technology for surveillance and censorship. The government has deployed sophisticated surveillance technologies, including facial recognition software and internet monitoring systems, to track and monitor citizens, raising serious concerns about privacy violations and the potential for abuse. Laws like the Information Technology, Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code Rules, 2021, grant the government sweeping powers to censor online content and hold social media companies accountable for content posted by users. These regulations have been criticized for stifling free speech online and creating a chilling effect on dissent. The government argues that these measures are necessary for national security and to combat fake news. However, critics argue that these powers are being used to silence dissent, target critics, and suppress information that is critical of the government. This blurring of the lines between national security and censorship further erodes democratic norms and creates a climate of fear and paranoia. Once hailed as a beacon of hope for democracies around the world, India's standing in global democracy indices has been steadily declining, downgraded India from a flawed democracy to a hybrid regime in 2021, citing democratic backsliding and erosion of civil liberties. The rise of Hindu nationalism and increased pressure on dissent are major concerns. Freedom House also downgraded India to partly free in 2022. Increased violence against journalists and critics signals a continued erosion of democratic freedoms. India's democracy is in peril, affecting the rights and freedoms of every citizen. India's press faces unprecedented crisis, with journalists facing intimidation, harassment, and violence. India's ranking in the World Press Freedom Index has plummeted to 150th out of 180 countries. This climate of fear forces many journalists to resort to self-censorship to protect themselves and their livelihoods. Social media platforms have emerged as vital spaces for free expression and dissent. However, the Indian government increasingly resorts to censorship and surveillance to control the narrative. The Information Technology Rules 2021 grant the government sweeping powers to censor online content. This creates an environment of fear and self-censorship online, where citizens hesitate to express their views freely. India has always prided itself on its secular fabric and unity in diversity. However, the rise of Hindu nationalism poses a grave threat to India's minorities, particularly Muslims. The Citizenship Amendment Act and the abrogation of Article 370 have marginalized the Muslim community. The rise in hate crimes against minorities, often fueled by social media, is alarming. While India boasts of rapid economic growth, the benefits have been highly uneven. The top 1% of Indians own more than 40% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% own a mere 3%. This growing economic disparity undermines the principle of one person, one vote. The frustration among those left behind by India's economic growth threatens to destabilize the country. Priya, a school teacher turned activist, raised her voice against a mining project on her ancestral land. She organized villagers, educating them about their rights and empowering them to resist. Accused of inciting violence, Priya was arrested on flimsy charges. Her story is repeated across India, where those who challenge the powerful are silenced through intimidation and imprisonment. Jaspal Singh, a farmer, faced new agricultural laws that threatened his livelihood. These laws, touted as reforms, represented a surrender to corporate interests. Driven by desperation, Jaspal joined thousands of farmers in protest. The government eventually repealed the laws, but the scars of the protests lingered. Rana Ayub, an investigative journalist, faced threats and harassment for her fearless reporting. Fabricated charges were leveled against her, and her bank accounts were frozen. The government seemed complicit in this witch hunt, using its agencies to harass her. Rana's story represents a dangerous trend in India, where journalists who question the official narrative are systematically targeted. A small Muslim community in northeast Delhi was torn apart by violence incited by inflammatory speeches. Homes were ransacked, businesses torched, and mosques desecrated. The police stood by as mute spectators to the carnage. The Delhi riots were a stark reminder of the fragility of India's secular fabric and the vulnerability of minorities. Professor Anand Teltumda, a scholar and civil rights activist, was arrested under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. The evidence against him was flimsy and fabricated. His case highlights the Indian government's use of anti-terror laws to silence dissent. Professor Teltumde's imprisonment is a chilling reminder of the shrinking space for dissent in India. India's story is an unfinished chapter, a narrative still being written. The dream of a vibrant, inclusive democracy is threatened by authoritarianism, intolerance, and inequality. The decline in democratic freedoms is a human tragedy, a betrayal of the hopes and aspirations of millions. Can India rise above the divisive forces and reclaim its legacy as a beacon of hope, where dissent is not a crime and justice and equality are a lived reality? The world watches India, its gaze filled with a mixture of concern and hope. India's success or failure as a democracy has global implications. As the world's largest democracy, its fate is tied to the global struggle for freedom and human rights. A thriving democracy in India can serve as a beacon of hope for other developing nations. However, a backsliding democracy would be a setback for the cause of democracy worldwide. It would embolden authoritarian forces globally. The responsibility for safeguarding India's democracy rests with its citizens. Their courage and resilience are a source of inspiration. The world is watching, waiting, and hoping that India will rise to the challenge. The time for action is now. The future of democracy hangs in the balance.